Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, visitors. Mr. President, I want to start my presentation this morning on the motion before us by indicating that at some other juncture in my life, I had the privilege of sitting on a committee at a local credit union, and as a member of the board of directors, I had responsibility with the rest of my team to review loans, and part of that time also included that time during the COVID period. And so you could well imagine that when I sit and when I listen to certain pronouncements and certain arguments, that I now perhaps appreciate even greater that experience that I had. Because so often it placed me in a situation that caused you to really ask a lot of questions when you got certain loan applications before you. And it meant that there are times when the decisions you took as a body to determine whether or not you granted a loan, whether or not you advised the member to reduce the amount, increase the amount, it really boiled down to the situation at hand, the member's own personal financing situation, and so on. And so, having also been given this opportunity today to speak to that motion, really again, like I said, indicates that perhaps that was an experience that had its own perks. I listened to the member opposite speak of what he deemed to have been the then opposition, indicating that borrowing was bad and borrowing should not have been done and so on. I mean, I know I'm a bit younger than him, and perhaps, I don't know, maybe I was still being formed at the time that it was being said. And I remember quite correctly that there were issues that were brought up in terms of the borrowing that the then government was doing. But I don't think I ever remember recalling that there was an issue with borrowing, but rather an issue with the manner in which the borrowing was being done. And that the borrowing was termed unsustainable, it was termed reckless. These were the terms that were being used, but I can never remember being that the then opposition indicated that the borrowing was bad. And I started with the analogy, Mr. President, to indicate that there were times when a member would come to you for a particular loan, say hypothetically of $10. But when you look at that member's debt stock, for example, you notice that they have a higher purchase account at Courts. You notice that they have taken something with Advanced Caribbean or with Accel Finance and so on. And when you look at the member's situation, you realize, you know what? It may be more prudent at the time to ask the member to perhaps increase it to $15, because $15 would mean that they can pay off these other loan obligations, that subsector, and bring it to what it can actually be. We know that there have been some issues in terms of theft for the CMOS, and so it is my hope that the Predial Larceny Unit will really come on board to really help provide some greater level of security, some greater level of safeguarding in terms of for the CMOS farmers, Mr. President. Mr. President, I go quickly to and I do not wish to be long because I think the motion is quite straightforward. I want to look at the street lighting, and of course I applaud the initiative because it is one, as somebody from a rural community, not that the issues are concentrated to rural community, but I think that there is a safety issue that the lights will help alleviate, and that is obvious. And also, like we've indicated before, the reduction of cost in terms of the reliance on fossil fuel. But I want to just stick up in quickly and indicate that I think as a country we should, and that conversation has happened, we remember the stories of the wind farm and so on, the greater thrust towards that other alternative source of energy. And so perhaps a combination of LED and solar-powered street lamps is something that we need to start thinking of and think of it for the longer term. And so I want to submit as well, Mr. President, that as much as perhaps my member opposite, and I know that it will be echoed by the other members. It was echoed in the lower house, and we know that there is normally a scripted repetition of what happens there. It mirrors in this house, and so we expect that it will come. But I want to submit, Mr. President, that within almost 300, less than 365 days, the government of St. Lucia has been able to, even prior to the submission of a budget, been able to maneuver well enough to be able to pay facilities fee for our students, and that is commendable. And sometimes, before I go into some, perhaps mention the others, I need to add that, in my opinion, as a head of a household, as a mother, as a working youth, one of the things that has always been obvious is that when you look at your expenses, when you look at your income and your expenses, when you look at a budget and so on, you always have to ask yourself where to place the monies and where will it be more effective, Mr. President. And so this is a government who have come in and recognized that as much as the financial space has been very, very difficult, the question of where do you place the eggs that you have in order to bring a level of relief to your people, and sometimes immediate relief, Mr. President. And I think it is something that my colleague really seems not to understand, because he was part of a movement of fluff, of grandeur, of glitter, of sequins. And so I do not think that he understands that sometimes when you place things in a particular way, that creates a bit of an ease of a squeeze. You just release the pressure. At least if that's all you can do at the time, you release the pressure and give people the ability to maneuver, Mr. President. So sometimes for me, it means that I don't get to eat an Italian ice cream at the end of the month, Mr. President, because the child needs an extra pencil. And it's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make, Mr. President, for the greater good. And so this is what this government has been doing. So yes, things have been bad. And yes, there has not been a lot of resources to go around. But this government understands that if I can then go out into the communities and help the elderly gentleman, the sick gentleman or the sick lady who lives alone, to repair the roof of their house, Mr. President. And so that is one of the burdens, that physiological need is met, and that burden is off of their back, Mr. President, that it will create a bit of a breathing space, Mr. President. And so perhaps a day or two, that individual can now put a piece of cheese in their bread and enjoy it like the rest of them, Mr. President. But they don't seem to understand that. In a time when things were really bad, the government of the day understood that as much as they could not perhaps give the 1.5 that my colleague opposite keeps speaking about, and I remember very, very early when we came in here, that he indicated that his current remuneration as a senator can no longer support his lifestyle. And so I suspect, Mr. President, that he's not been asking for that 1.5 for the rest of St. Lucia, you know. I suspect he has been crying for himself. So there is a bit of empathy and sympathy that I must show towards my member. But when the public servants, a promise made to the public servants in terms of an increase in their salaries was met by this administration, it was done, Mr. President. It speaks to a government who are looking out for their people, and a government who understands that even though we cannot move Monjini from one place to the next, but we can do these little things that will ease the squeeze, Mr. President. And I can go on about the other things. My son, who is in Form 2, came home with a laptop a couple days ago. And Mr. President, the reality is, with 2 children in the household, I had bought devices, I bought tablets, I bought laptops. Unfortunately, it was at a juncture when my son had just said, "Mommy, my laptop not going on." And then the government announced, well, I should have sent it so that you all could have cleaned it up. I should have done that a few years ago. You are correct, Mr. Colleague Senator. So these are the little things that the government had done to ease the squeeze. And it allowed for a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of leeway. And so, Mr. President, it is based on these submissions, and they did it without having to create a Madi Poete. I mean, if I have to count the amount of Tuesdays in that almost 365 days, we had a couple Tuesdays. And so if the current government had followed the path of the previous government, I mean, if we pull out a calendar, we'll be able to determine how many Tuesdays has been in that period of time. And so it speaks for itself, Mr. President. And so I want to say that I applaud the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister, Honorable Philippe J. Pierre, in the manner in which he has been able to manage the economy, in the manner in which he has been able to ease and soothe the pains and the qualms of people, especially the people who need it most, Mr. President. Persons at the lower prongs of the income ladder, persons who have no income because they've lost it during COVID-19. These people are grateful, Mr. President, for what their government has been able to do for them within the last 11 months. And maybe some people do not understand it, but the people who have actually felt the effects of the policies of this government, you walk through the length of breadth of St. Lucia, and they are grateful for what has been done. And this is what matters, Mr. President. The fact that the people know, they understand, because they feel the difference that has been done in their pockets, in their households, in the way in which they've been able to live, Mr. President. And so, like I said, I will not be long. I make these submissions, Mr. President, in support of the motion before us, Mr. President. I thank you.